What's up, y'all? It's Dr. Hasan-Johnson. Just thought I'd drop a quick word. I'm going to start doing a few short videos, probably at least about 2 a week on YouTube. And I kind of wanted to just deal with something that popped out at me yesterday that I thought deserved at least a little bit of a response. And that was Oprah Winfrey's symbolic walk to support Ahmaud Arbery in his death. Getting some attention called out to it, and as much as I appreciate when celebrities do that to call attention to things that might get buried, because as we know, Arbery was killed quite a while ago, and it actually, just like with Trayvon Martin, it took everyday people in social media to force the issue into the national conversation. So I appreciate when celebrities do bring attention to things. I resent the fact that they need to in order for us to get certain needs met, but I usually appreciate that. And I did to some extent with Oprah, but I found the walk itself hollow. 2.6 mile walk to commemorate what he experienced, his death, and it struck me as hollow, especially particularly because that comes from a woman who, made a career out of denigrating black men. Whether we take it back to her early advocacy of Alice Walker's work in The Color Purple, all the way up to the documentary film she made on Michael Jackson, and the recent one she got called out for by the likes of 50 Cent for trying to do on Russell Simmons. So this looked like a very quick kind of a grab for some degree of credit to deflect from that, especially considering that her and her girl Gail just recently, in Gail's kind of dismissing of Kobe's death, she came to Gail's aid, as one would expect. This just looked like a quick grab at some degree of credibility when it comes to talking about black men. And the same goes for, Very Smart Brothers, the piece they recently did, trying to call some attention to his death, but with the legacy they have of just denigrating black men, a lot of people weren't having it, and I'm glad that brothers were outspoken in particular. But anyone that challenged them on that, I appreciate. Nevertheless, back to Oprah. I took issue with that. Her legacy is problematic to me. I go back to being a little kid, watching The Color Purple, and I remember this scene where Celie finally gets hold of the letters her sister wrote her, right? And there's a scene where she's standing on the dock of a train station reading the letters, and her sister is talking about going to Africa and so on and so forth. And in front of her, there are these black men working on a chain gang, right? And I remember thinking as a little boy, these might be the only men in this film that weren't, overtly problematic. Thing about it is they were more than likely convicts, working on a chain gang, working for a prison, having their labor forced out. But nonetheless, they only were there for a few seconds, and I'm looking at Celie, who's living in this big house, and we're supposed to be feeling for the pain she's going through, and I'm just like, but then there are these silent men in the background. Well, they're not entirely silent, but they're in the background nonetheless. No word on them. No word about systemic racism. No word on the exploitation of black men in particular. It was all about, just this venomous man, and that's it. And I'm just looking at this like there's something highly problematic with this. There's no attention drawn to any of these men who represent a good portion of black men, then and now. I haven't seen Oprah call very much attention to any of those things that are still occurring. So I take it with a grain of salt, right? But the other thing I had a problem with is she really went in on this notion of, supporting the mother. And that's become one of the more popular tropes. Really, we can take it back to Mamie Till, mother of Emmett Till in the mid-1950s, who was courageous enough to put, and probably traumatized enough too, let's be real, but put her son's remains on display for the world to see, using Jet magazine and subsequently others at that point to really shame America internationally. And it was a powerful moment too, and she took advantage of a powerful moment because we were in the midst of the Cold War. The United States was holding itself up to be a bastion of democracy and freedom, And yet you have these little Negroes who are being killed and attacked with dogs, a little bit, and I think that in and of itself was an embarrassment. But that gave African Americans an international voice, because we became the barometer for racism, at a time when the world really wanted to see what the United States was capable of. So Mamie Till, shout out to her, and peace be upon her name. She brought a lot of attention to her son. So we fast forward with that to 2015. We have the death of Trayvon Martin. And if you remember, at that point in time, most of a good portion of Black America knew he died before his own family did, because nobody had called them for a few days. But the video, had gone out, of the imagery. And yet the national news forgot about it until everyday people took to social media to demand its return, much the way we did with Ahmaud Arbery. Still, from that moment on, you had the advent of Black Lives Matter, and that took off by the time we got to Michael Brown's death. So here you have this organization advocating for Black feminism and LGBT rights, and they're using the death of let's just say it, stop dancing around it, we're using the deaths of heterosexual Black males, because all of a sudden sexuality doesn't matter for them, but it somehow matters after the fact when we want to talk about who should get the currency for their deaths. So nonetheless, what you have happening is this rise of a new method of using Black male deaths to cater to demographics that aren't directly impacted by such things. I mean, we know Black males tend to die 200 to 300 times a year by police, and that doesn't even include vigilante murders. And when it comes to Black women, that number's back about down to 9 to 20. And 20 was just really an outlier year, because there were actually I don't want to say it was about 9 or 10 cases where you had people crashing cars, women in particular driving away from police officers. But usually it's somewhere between 9 and 10, about 200 to 300 Black males. And yet, in none of this do we see Black males actually gaining any kind of currency from that. We don't see any rights, we don't see any laws, we don't see any policies, we don't see any organizations that actually cater directly to Black male needs and issues. And this is my problem with Oprah and her gesture at the Mothers of the Movement. The Mothers of the Movement became something popular, especially by the time you get to the last Democratic National Convention, where they held them up, as these kind of martyred women because they lost their sons. And peace to them. I don't mean them any disrespect, but I found that the erasure of Black fathers, and even to some extent the erasure of the sons who died themselves, is part of my issue, right? No real investment in who the sons were, what they were interested in, what they liked to do, what their goals were. It immediately became about the mothers. And that's not necessarily Black women's fault. I think in many ways in the West, the way we process empathy, we don't know how to empathize for men, particularly Black men, or boys for that matter. Because we know, starting in kindergarten, they're seen as much older than they actually are, sometimes a little bit before kindergarten. So empathizing for men and males in general, America doesn't really process things that way. But we do know how to empathize for women and girls. So it's understandable that the women would be the ones that would be the proper sign to, trigger a degree of empathy. But the extent to which that ends up being translated into currency for Black feminist, gestures, politics, interests, and yet nothing for Black boys is problematic. Because the organization itself, when you look at Black Lives Matter, were very overt about making the statement that this organization was for Black women and to represent Black women's issues, right? They didn't let Black men in any positions of leadership, and they were very outspoken about that. I sat in Black Lives Matter meetings and watched them excuse Black men, dismiss Black men's concerns, while at the same time trafficking in Black male death for the sake of baiting and switching the attention they received onto other issues that had nothing to do with the Black men who were killed themselves, right? And that to me is a problem. And they also wouldn't actually cover the actual number of Black male deaths per year. So I would hear people complaining about the fact that we could remember 4 or 5 Black males killed over the last 5 years, and we often couldn't do that for other groups, but nobody wanted to talk about the fact that there were, in that 5-year period, anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 Black men who were killed, and we only remember 4 or 5. Nobody wants to talk about that. So my problem with this whole Mothers of the Movement press, especially as propagated by Oprah, is that it overlooks the lives of Black men and boys. It dismisses their value, dismisses their humanity, in an effort to give a very small portion, politically active portion of the population, political currency, particularly with the Democratic Party. Right? We already know black women vote at the highest percentages out of any other group for the Democrats. Black males actually tend to vote just underneath them, higher than any other group following black women, but that's somehow dismissed. And much of the politics that comes out of the Democratic Party as targeted to black America focuses on black women's interests. And they're the I would argue, fastest growing demographic in terms of electoral politics that's coming into the fray. And much of that is a product of education. Right? Education that they get, that black males suffer from, and yet no severe policy that targets black males in terms of improving their standing. So in California, you have a 75% illiteracy rate for black boys. No kind of political representation about that at all. Right? None. And that's the kind of problem I have for that. Black boys become really, cannon fodder for a machine that churns them out, uses their deaths for others, and then dismisses them entirely. And we're supposed to stand and applaud. So my issue is not against the mothers who've lost their children by any means, but my issue is when black male deaths are used as currency for issues that don't even pertain to them, while their real lived situations are thoroughly ignored. I take high issue with that. And I think it needs to be called out. So this march that Oprah does and this gesture at Oprah's mother in support of this notion of mothers of the movement, yeah, I call that into question. All right. Peace, y'all.